There was no announcement when Harry and Meghan stopped being discussed seriously inside the palace. No memo, no warning, no confrontation. The conversations simply changed. And that change mattered more than any public statement that came later. To understand what happened, you have to ignore the headlines and look at what institutions do when they believe time will solve a problem better than force ever could. In the years following Harry's marriage to Meghan, Buckingham Palace faced something it was structurally unprepared for. Not rebellion, but unpredictability. Rebellion can be managed, unpredictability cannot. At first, the response was engagement. Committees, briefings, carefully worded discussions about modernization, representation, and public messaging. Harry was still treated as a core figure, Meghan as a variable that could be integrated. But institutions don't change their center of gravity quickly. They observe first. And what they observed unsettled them. Not because of intention, but because of trajectory. According to multiple palace-adjacent accounts, internal discussions began shifting away from what Harry and Meghan wanted toward what the monarchy would need to absorb if they continued. That distinction marked the beginning of distance. No one suggested removal, no one suggested exile. Instead, something quieter happened. Planning documents began including contingencies where Harry was no longer essential, not absent, just non-central. That's a crucial difference, because once someone is no longer central, the institution doesn't need to confront them, it only needs to wait. By late 2018, internal language reportedly shifted. Harry and Meghan were no longer framed as future-facing assets, but as operational considerations. Again, not punishment, reclassification. The palace didn't argue with them, it repositioned around them, and that repositioning accelerated after one realization became clear internally. Harry and Meghan were not seeking negotiation, they were seeking autonomy. Autonomy is incompatible with monarchy, not morally, but structurally. Monarchy survived through managed alignment, not independent momentum. Once that became apparent, the palace's behavior changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. Access narrowed, decision loops shortened, information flows adjusted, not to control, but to reduce exposure. This is where many people misunderstand the situation. They imagine dramatic meetings, emotional ultimatums, and cold dismissals. That's not how institutions work. The palace did not push Harry and Meghan out. It made staying less meaningful. By the time the couple publicly stepped back, insiders were not shocked, because internally, the system had already adapted to a future where they were peripheral. What followed was not retaliation. It was confirmation. Once Harry and Meghan chose separation publicly, the palace's response was almost procedural. Titles reassessed, roles clarified, funding structures formalized. Nothing emotional, nothing personal, because the emotional decision had already been made, quietly, long before. What's especially telling is what didn't happen afterward. There was no sustained effort to reintegrate them, no prolonged negotiation, no institutional struggle. That absence speaks volumes. Institutions fight for what they believe they still need. They let go of what they've already replaced. And by the time Harry and Meghan left, the palace had already rewritten its internal future without them at the center. Harry, in particular, found himself in a paradox. Still a prince, still visible, still emotionally tied, but no longer structurally essential. And that is the most destabilizing position of all, because power doesn't come from titles, it comes from necessity. Meghan, meanwhile, represented something the institution couldn't standardize. Not controversy, velocity. Narrative speed, media acceleration, public discourse that moved faster than palace rhythm. The monarchy cannot operate at that speed. So instead of trying to catch up, it slowed everything else down until the gap became permanent. By the time public interviews and documentaries reframed the story, the internal decision had already solidified. The palace wasn't responding, it was maintaining. And maintenance requires emotional neutrality. That's why the responses sounded cold, why the statements felt distant, why reconciliation always seemed abstract, because reconciliation was no longer a structural priority. The system had already stabilized without them. This is the part most people miss. Harry and Meghan didn't lose a battle with the palace. They outpaced it. And institutions don't chase. They endure. When the palace stopped discussing Harry and Meghan as a problem to solve, the outcome became inevitable. Because silence in royal systems is not avoidance, it's resolution. And once resolution sets in, everything that follows feels strangely calm, not because nothing was lost, but because the institution had already moved on.